Hey y'all, welcome back to the Not Sorry Art podcast. I'm Sari. Thanks for being here. In today's episode, I get to sit down and chat with Megan Collins, who is a cultural insight analyst and a generational expert. Megan is an incredibly creative person. I first found her on TikTok and I really enjoyed her insight and how she broke down these bigger, heavier topics like trend forecasting in a really applicable way. And if you had asked me a few years ago why a generational analyst or a trend forecaster would be relevant to a visual artist, I would have been curious too. I would have said I have no clue. However, Megan, her content is one of those things where I listen to it kind of on my periphery and then I find myself going back to it because there's something insightful about how creative people are inspired and our role in sort of the cultural ecosystem that I have found to be incredibly valuable. And I wanted to share that with you guys. Some of the questions we talk about are: what is the position of the artist in the cultural ecosystem, and how can trend forecasting and sort of the concepts behind it be useful for visual artists? We also talk about the importance of sort of cross training as a creative. I view Megan Collins as an incredibly creative person. She's a writer, she's a podcaster, she works in a creative industry. But I also was able to paint with Megan on my retreat in Spain. And what I really enjoyed about her was that she had very little experience actually in painting, but she considers herself an incredibly creative person. And I feel like it was one of those experiences where I learned as much from her as she did from me. And so we chat a little bit about the value of sort of pushing yourself creatively, trying out different mediums, even though it's not your typical wheelhouse, and how that can be an incredibly helpful process. And finally, we talk about how the isolation of being an artist at the beginning of the trend curve, which, spoiler alert, most artists are well ahead of the trend curve, how we can sort of support ourselves in that journey and not feel like we're speaking a whole different language than the rest of the culture. And I know as artists, sometimes it can feel that way when you are, deep into your work and it seems like you're the only one interested in your niche subject. It can feel a little isolating. So we talk about other ways that you can sort of support yourself. And again, really finding comfort in the position of an artist in our cultural ecosystem. I so enjoyed this conversation and I hope you guys find it really interesting and get something out of it. If any of those things sound interesting to you, then strap in. Let's dive into the episode. I want to say a huge thank you again to Megan Collins for sharing some of your time and insight with us. If you'd like to follow Megan Collins, you can find her on TikTok under the handle at Virgo Like Beyonce. You can also listen to her podcast, Megan's Pod. I'll link it in the show notes. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome so much, Megan Collins. I'm so excited for you to be here. Full disclosure to my audience, I am such a big fan of you. I found you on TikTok, as most of my most recent great loves in my life. And I just thought you had such a good take on so much on pop culture. I feel like you do a really good job sort of sitting between trend forecasting and conversations about pop culture in a way that's really accessible and insightful. And so, I feel like my audience, if they enjoy my content, they're just going to adore you. And especially if, again, you have that bend towards pop culture. Thank you for being here. I guess my first question for you is, can you explain a little bit more about trend forecasting and what goes into it? And more specifically, like the creative process of it. Because I think one thing about you is that I know you from a little bit more insight here from the retreat in Spain, and I know you are a very creative person. And so if you wanted to break it down like a creative practice, could you break down what goes into trend forecasting?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here as well. Trend forecasting is basically the process of, it's basically like cultural anthropology. But for popular culture, and then taking what you know and kind of saying, okay, this is what we see happening in the future. And there's different ways that people go about it. And just like a creative practice, no two trend forecasters, I'm sure, have the same practice. But for me specifically, the simplest way to describe it is three is a trend. But it's a little more abstract than I've seen three people wearing the color pink. So pink is a trend. And so I think what trend forecasters really do is look at these more subtle trends that people might not be picking up on yet until they're like really, really picking up steam. So things that might not seem connected drawing the parallels between those things and being like, actually, these things all have something in common. And it points to people moving more towards this direction, whatever that may be.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious where you go for inspiration because, in conventional sort of art interviews, people will ask, like, how did you get into it and where do you find inspiration? Because I can't imagine, well, I can imagine that where you're sourcing your information is as much part of what you're finding as anything. And so do you go out in physical spaces? Do you have places online that you sort of frequent? Because for artists, for example, a lot of us will do like a rotation of like Pinterest, our favorite movies, our favorite painters, and we sort of have a Rolodex of places we go. I'm curious if your process and where you physically find inspiration is similar.
Yes and no. So, like I said, there's lots of different ways that trend forecasters go about it. And I obviously have like a wealth of resources, but I think like the macro way to think about it is in trend forecasting and specifically the way I practice and my trend forecasting analysis, we talk about the curve a lot. So there's the cultural curve, and there's three pieces to this: residual, dominant, and emergent. And the idea is that everything sits somewhere along that curve. Things have kind of like a cultural peak when people are the most interested. That's when they're dominant. And I would say that my approach to trend forecasting has just been to live at the emergent end of the curve where things are happening so that I don't have to go out looking for them. I'm just simply immersed in it. And I do have a leg up living in LA. So, that's where there's a lot of forward thinking culture here and a lot of like free thinking and just, people are more open minded to new things and trying new things. So there's that. And then just talking to people and really, I think following my interests, like whether that's going on a painting retreat in Spain and talking to all the interesting, cool people there, or it's learning about people who are also living at that part of the curve, but maybe have insight to different parts that I don't, like the cutting edge of sports, the cutting edge of video games. Anytime I meet someone who has a really unique interest that I don't have, I am so open to like, tell me everything about this. I want to know why you like this, and not just like what you're doing, but like what is it delivering for you, and what is it bringing to your life. And so I find that that's easier to do, to just steep yourself in it rather than say, okay, what's happening with, 25-year-old women. It's like, oh, I know because I'm following the same accounts that they are on TikTok, and I'm like listening to the same podcasts that they are. And sometimes that means I do have to keep up with things that aren't my favorite. Like, I'll have to watch the top YouTubers just so that I know what's happening on YouTube, even if they're not necessarily my taste. But I think that part of what makes it interesting for me is to find points of entry that are truly authentic to me and then really exploring from there, but really living at the emergent end of the curve. And then the other thing that I do is, and I made a TikTok about this that I think that you commented on too, was I'm really thoughtful about who I follow and where I get my sources. And in this TikTok video, I talked about following like one person who looks like you. So, like, as a Black woman, that's a thing where, like, sure, someone can be like, oh, try these 15 hairstyles, but maybe only one of them is going to work on me. So, really looking to people who have things in common with you. So, whether that's someone who looks like you, someone who thinks like you, and, that's why I follow you for your great takes on not just art, but like the meaning beyond it and capitalism and the entire system of what goes into who gets to create art. And then lastly, someone within your tax bracket, because I think that is also important that you're understanding kind of where you're at in not just culture, but socioeconomic status, because I think that's also a danger of living at this cutting edge of the curve, is that you could falsely think that everyone lives like you and this is what life is like for everybody. But you have to keep in mind that it's not. And I think staying in touch with other people, whether that's globally, middle America, the other coasts. So it's understanding like I'm living at the edge of the curve. Not everyone is. So I might have a little bit of foresight into where we're headed, but that doesn't mean that I'm an expert on everything everywhere.
Yeah, no, I think that's so helpful. And that's such golden advice about being really intentional with who you're following and who you're consuming, both like intentionally who you're wanting to consume and then who you are like filtering out and being really aware of that. And then I wanted to break down a little bit why a trend forecaster would be such an important person to talk to for artists. I think I sort of can be blind to it because I've just valued your work for so long that I'm like, yeah, of course, it's really helpful to listen to what Megan thinks. But I think something that artists really it's a tough part, especially if you're an artist on social media, that you think that it's just about keeping up with trends, because there are trends to art, and a part of being an artist for most people is selling their goods. And I feel like a lot of e-commerce and stuff, they really are sitting at the middle of that graph. I'm going to include in the show notes kind of an image of the graph that Megan is talking about. But for artists and trend forecasters, I think what's kind of similar and unique is that what goes into inspiration is both super duper important for both. I feel like artists sort of unintentionally bump into those things, and because you do it more for work, and I would hope that you enjoy it and there's like a lot of pleasure and overlap in that, but the way you come up with inspiration is like pertinent to your job in a way that for artists, I feel like sometimes it can feel very subconscious, like who you're paying attention to, who you're listening to, where you're going, what you're looking for as far as inspiration. And so, for someone who is trying to find their style or not always be behind the curve, I feel like a lot of what you talk about is super helpful to people. And that was kind of my next question, is like, what is a trend curve? But I'm curious from you, like, where do artists usually fall on that curve? Or do artists have a place in the trend forecasting ecosystem?
Artists definitely have a place in the trend forecasting ecosystem. And I would say artists also live at this emergent part of the curve. I think commerce does complicate that because so much of what is profitable, so much of what is profitable is in that middle part of the curve where things are really popular and dominant and not quite as cutting edge or challenging the status quo, which I think is kind of what artists want to be doing, as far as I know. But I think one challenge for me too is understanding that my role in the capitalist system is to elevate things before they're popular. And I want to do that responsibly. So I don't want to take like an artist's work and say, disco balls are the next big thing. It's all about disco balls. I want to up level that somehow and say, there's this really great artist, Sari, who paints these disco balls. And what does this tell us about the ways that artists are breaking out of the mold from painting on, rectangular canvases, that we're seeing like this explosion of shapes and colors? So maybe kind of even challenge the people who I'm giving these insights to up level the artist in some way, take the artist idea further than just one for one copying what the artists have done. So I think of my job as, when I'm doing it well, as kind of a bridge between these culture emergent, really creative people and the capitalist system that wants to spread that and make it available to the masses. Because I do think that there is the argument to be made that not everyone can afford an original disco ball, but might like to get in on the joy and the happiness, and there is a place for that to be done responsibly, right? So that is my goal, to kind of like be that bridge. But I do think that it's harder for artists, especially in these days. I see so many getting ripped off, just like straight up take their art and take their creativity. And I think that makes me sad, obviously, for the artist, but it also makes me sad because that is where culture is made. And if you take that away from artists, if you disenfranchise them, if you de-incentivize them from creating just for the sake of creating, you don't get culture pushed forward, and you don't get these beautiful things, and you don't get like a renaissance. And so I think that there is definitely a place for artists, and I try as much as I can to like protect that. The old model of trend forecasting that was most popular, actually we would call like an influencer, had nothing to do with social media following. It was someone who was influential within their community in driving ideas and culture and habits and trends. And it's kind of co-opted by capitalism to be someone who can impact the bottom line. Are still like that step one, where they are creators, first and foremost, who then have the power to influence influencers.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I whenever I was having sort of the back and forth with my disco balls, for just a tiny bit of context, I'm sure everyone's sick of the disco ball story, but I came up with this idea in 2019. It was one of those ideas and I have these ideas all the time. I think they're unique, and then I Google it and it's already a thing. It's just, I'm sure a lot of people do that, but the disco balls were really unique. And that I was like, well, surely someone's done this on a circle canvas. Googled it. As far as I could tell, I didn't see it. And, eventually disco balls were having a moment culturally. I probably was picking up on something on the zeitgeist. Nothing is truly, started from within. I mean, rarely, I suppose, but, and it turned into a thing. And luckily I was in a position and I had, enough of a following and a size. And I already set up an e-commerce that I was able to sort of ride that wave and, financially and in my career profit from it. So I think, all things considered, that was a really, kind of a win for me in a lot of ways. But I know that a lot of artists maybe aren't kind of set up in that way. And so I talk about the issue and being respectful and stuff like that to sort of help other people. But I think one of the things that you do in your work that has been really reassuring to me, if something like that happens and someone doesn't, find a way to sort of cash in on their idea or being at the beginning of that bell curve. One of the things that was really reassuring about what you're doing is I didn't ever figure out the word or the ideas behind the fact that being an artist means that you sort of are inherently playing around the beginning of the curve. And if you've done it once, you can do it again, because that is where your job, your interest, your desire has already sort of led you. And so I, can tell myself all day long, if, you can come up with more ideas and it's a platitude and, okay, sure, maybe I can. But seeing kind of what you do and in your work and knowing that there is, even if it's subconscious, there is a formula to it, that if you're led by your interests, if you're, curious and open and continuing to put in the work, you will continue to sort of do that. And it's not the same pace for everyone. And again, I'm not saying it's a good thing to have your stuff ripped off, but a reassuring thing that I learned from you is that no, there's science to this. And if you're playing at the beginning of, if you're an influencer, ye old influencer, that it will happen again, and that it's worth putting your energy, time, and really being loving and careful of that, taking in an inspiration process. And I don't know, but that gave me a ton of relief when I found kind of what you were doing on the internet and how you were talking about the trend curve and everything.
Yeah, one of the ways I think about it that's less like researchy and graphy is like if humanity and we're all walking down a path, right? And we're all headed the same way. If you're just a little ahead, you're seeing things before everyone else is, and you can point them out, and people may or may not listen. And you can either sit there and keep pointing and take credit for being the first person to notice, or you can keep walking and keep going ahead and see the next thing before people do. And that used to be very frustrating for me because mythology of Cassandra. So she was like cursed with seeing the future, but no one would believe her.
Right.
That's kind of what it feels like to be a trend forecaster sometimes, of like you just see things coming, but people just don't really believe you. And then a few years later, everyone's like, oh, this is a big thing. And you're like, I told you that 2 years ago. And I used to get really frustrated and like pull up the receipts and say, I've been telling you guys this. And now I'm just like, I'm taking that as reassurance, and I kind of take it as like, oh, okay, so that's how far ahead I am. And kind of like in my own head be like, oh, okay, so this person who's telling me about this thing I noticed 2 years ago is 2 years down the path from where I am. So, and then I kind of think, okay, what else 2 years ago might have been interesting to me? And then I'll be like, oh, and did you know this? And I'll be like, oh, that's really cool. And kind of use it as a way to connect, as opposed to be annoyed that they're not quite as caught up to where I am, And I know it can get so annoying when someone's like taking credit for things. And I've kind of tried to use it to my advantage, especially when it comes to like the discourse and like thought leadership. Of it can be very frustrating for someone to take credit for your thought leadership. But I'm like, I mean, if they're spreading it, and ultimately I want the message out there more than I want to take credit for the message. So I'm fine with that. And like I said, I know that that's different for artists because that's how you make your living. But it is very important for artists to remember that they're doing something more valuable than just like the actual painting on the canvas. And creativity is more than just like what people are, how much people are going to appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I really appreciate your insight on that. And I think another thing that's been really valuable from both this conversation and following you and listening to your thoughts is, artists are always talking to what feels like a void. And, you have sales that give you some
Same.
insight. Yeah. and you have your peers, but it's hard to sort of I think a theme in this episode is that, the value of sort of marching to the beat of your own drum, no matter kind of how that looks for you. And, one thing I see a lot happen to artists is, you get kind of lost in like, what are people thinking of my artwork and how is this responding? And and I've, the disco ball thing for me was me being on time and in a good trajectory, but I've also had bodies of work. Like I did a big teenage still life series several years ago, and I put it out to all the like, places that you should put your work when you finish something and polished it, and New American Magazine and all this good stuff. Anyways, and it did not land well. It was, very feminine, very teenage. And very recently, like within the last couple of weeks, there's been some CDC reports and some really good discourse about like the pressure on adolescent girls. And that was something I was very intentional with the artwork. It wasn't just a cheap, nostalgic, look at the past. It was, the Sunny D jug, because as a reference to Juno and what it looks like to be dismissed and then have the pressure of, legislation, big, heavy, front of mind legislation on your shoulders, and sort of the dissonance of that emotion. And so when I made it, I was saying those things and it didn't land. And I had some people who were interested. And I think at the end of the day, if you have just like a small group of people who like what you're doing, you're gold. But now I'm sort of seeing other people who, I won't get into the weeds, but who are saying what I was saying, later. And that's fine. I've worked through that body of work. But I think what you do, and that's really valuable, is you give sort of some logic to what is happening there, that it's like you might just be ahead of the curve. Like the curve works like this. Media, thoughts, we think that thoughts travel overnight, but they actually take years, months, maybe decades even to sort of permeate. And it's been really helpful as an artist to understand how you break down trends. And as artists, we like to think that we're not about trends and we're above trends, but truthfully, trends are a lot of what we do. Granted, it's at the beginning of that arch, but your commerce is attached to the middle. You being understood and accepted is attached to the middle. I mean, how many cases of artists who were like just never understood in their time and they died penniless, and now what they did makes perfect sense in the zeitgeist. We see that over and over. And I think what you're doing, talking about not only trend forecasting but culture and sort of giving examples in real time, has been incredibly helpful to me, and I would assume to other people listening that that's going to be a really nice thing to think about. I mean, I guess so. My question for you is there something that artists should be thinking about? Like if they keep finding themselves way ahead of the curve, is there anything that you would tell them, or like that would help them sort of ride out that gap where people haven't quite caught on to what they're doing and what they're making?
I would have to think, to be honest, but my first instinct is just find your people. So when you talked about like your body of work, I feel like I think that was the first body of work I saw from you, the teenage girl still lifes. And that is something that is very important to me in my work and like what I do in my day job of like advocating for teenage girls. And, your work impacted me and my stance on that. So it's like, while I may not have bought one of those pieces at the time, it still helps spread a message. And I think as I, continue to go about my career and spread the word about you and talk about you, that's going to bring more eyes to that. And so I think the way I like to think about it is planting seeds, because especially when you're so far ahead, right, of this path that we're talking about. So you got to plant seeds and then hope that other people water them and that they'll grow. But it takes time and patience. And even with me, I've been making content on the internet since I was like 13 years old. And I've only just now like started to get a following. You know what I mean? And not that I was ever trying, but it's just like when it's like, I think there is something to when your time to be on the stage, you will be on the stage and people will be saying, okay, what is it that we need to learn from you? There is a little bit, it's crowded now with social media and all of that. But I think just trying to find your people. We're seeing more people, audiences, especially on social media, want more smaller communities. They don't necessarily want to follow the influencers who have, 10 billion followers. And while that seems like, okay, what does that mean for me as an artist? That's going to trickle down throughout all parts of consumerism. And even as I've seen more interest in the art world, like, as I said, I live at the emergent end of the curve, and art is only something that I felt was accessible to me in the last few years through people like you. So as that continues to be a thing, it's going to be less about getting recognition from the mainstream art establishment and more of an established community, and having like a community of buyers and collectors and people who are interested in your work. And there is an element of art as kind of like, I've kind of been thinking about it like a horcrux of like thought and ideas and like energies. And I think that that's something that's going to continue to resonate with people, and that they're going to want to buy art and even just an art print from artists who they align with and their values, beyond just, oh, this will look good in this corner of my house. I feel like I had one other thought on that,
Yeah.
but it escaped me.
No, that's good. No, I love that. And that's really encouraging, I think, to hear for artists, because I mean, that's something I've thought for a while. Art more so than I think a lot of kinds of art, the visual art world has really had this monopoly. I mean, if you look at graphs, like it's, I think there's like 90 artists that basically generate like 90 something percent of the income. I mean, it's a blue chip sort of game, and it's really not connected to, I think, what art is at its core, which is just visual communication. And so, you saying that the internet is only now starting to be at a place where it's prime for that. I've certainly seen that in my work. People assume that it's like, in order to be a successful artist, you have to be able to cast this incredibly wide net. And I can tell you from personal experience that that's not the case, that really coming up with that small community and, kind of to your point, planting seeds, both in like the art that you're making and the statements that you're making, but also in the sense of community, and really letting it be a slow, organic build. Because something that you reminded me of is things kind of have their time. And sometimes when you're picking up on something at the very beginning of that curve, it's so quiet that it's like no one has made the statement yet. It hasn't gotten to the part of the curve where there's someone with a sandwich board and yelling the thing that's happening, right? No one has made it a think piece yet. And so it's going to feel this like abstract, like, I don't know, man. Adolescent, I feel like there's a lot of shame around it. No one's really talked about it, and then by the time you're making art, it does have this domino effect. And I think one of the messages I would want to make to someone who's listening to this episode is really urging them to listen to themselves and have patience, because even with like what you're doing, so, you do a really good job sort of blending pop culture takes, views on sort of like aesthetics and lots of other interests that typically feel like they fall on the other side of like deep critical thought. And I remember, and they're not, but and I remember several years ago, maybe not a decade ago, I used to listen to this podcast called Things Your Mother Didn't Tell You or something like that. And they had an author on, and I forget her name, I'll link it in the show notes, but she wrote basically a book about how to digest trash TV, like Real Housewives, and not lose the critical part of yourself. And I remember that felt so like pivotal and mind blowing at the time. And like, I really had to sift through it. And it feels like what you're like that. So you saying what you're saying now back then, I feel like I could see why that wouldn't land. We were not culturally, or at least I wasn't primed to take in that information. It still felt like, things that girls like, how can that be critical? But now we're sort of at a place where we're like, oh yeah, no, that does make sense. It's actually another avenue we can break down values in our culture. And because I've learned from you, like, I know that those things aren't opposite. So, I feel like even hearing you say, I've been putting out these thoughts for years, I've been working in this for years, and you having the patience to push through, and now you're sort of reaping the rewards and, picking the flowers. If we're going to continue with the metaphor, it's just been a really cool process to watch, I guess.
Yeah. And my friend Mary actually put it well. She said it's very lonely at the forefront, because there aren't that many people just there with you, just by inherent, like the way numbers work, right? At the front end of the curve where there's only a few people doing something, there's just not that many people. And so you really have to try harder to seek out those perspectives, to feel like someone else is in it with you and having those same thoughts, because it can be like, am I crazy? Like, where is everybody else? Why is no one else seeing the thing that I'm seeing? And then a few years later, everyone catches up and you're like, oh, okay. And I feel like so much of my first like 5 years of my career was kind of just learning to trust myself, because I had to be like, really say, no, I believe that this is going to blow up. And so much of my job is predicting things, but it's having confidence in it, because if I don't believe it, the people who I'm talking to are not going to believe it. So I've had to learn, but I think it's important to do it, put it out there, and then you revisit the past stuff you did and you're like, oh, I was correct. And I'm not always exactly correct, but it's close enough. Or I'm like, oh, I see how this event impacted this to go differently than we thought it was going to go. But having that to look back on is really reassuring and validating just for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you brought up trust, because that was something when, you were talking that I kept thinking. It's like, yeah, you have to really learn to trust yourself. And certainly I think as an artist, it's the same thing. It's like, how do you, tether yourself to this big, long project and pour all this money into this vision, and, and maybe it won't pan out. And it is a real act of trust to be at that end of the inspiration end of the spectrum. And, I'm curious, I know you are a Virgo and you're very organized. And I feel like you do a lot of great, where my more cluttered Sagittarius energy, like will do it all in my brain and try to get it figured out there. You do a great job, like pulling things into the real world and making charts and stuff. Is there anything, if I could ask you, is there like a good companion guide to what should someone do if they're at that end, if they're at the lowly end of the pool and they're making work and they don't know if they should trust themselves? Like, is there some good practices that you would recommend for someone who's in that space of their career?
Yes. So my biggest tip is to first, everything you do needs to be within your own nature. So I am just like an organized, note-taking morning person. So to tell you, like, get up every day and I have 4 journals I write it and they're all different topics, that's not helpful, because that's trying to be something you're not. And even with my trend forecasting, I have integrated into my life. And so I think that that would be my biggest thing, is just kind of think about the places where you're just naturally getting inspiration. Think about how you're going about that and figure out how you can capture that. So one thing that I do, for instance, is I take a lot of my inspiration around like what people are talking about or what people care about from TikTok. And so I'll use the TikTok save feature and I'll make boards of like different topics. And maybe they're not something I'm researching for work yet or something I'm studying, just something I'm noticing. And then I'll be like, hey, actually, I've noticed that there's 17 videos about this specific book. Is there something that we should look into here? So it's not about trying to make yourself or make your habits into something you're not, but really what I call mining the process of that you're and formalizing how you already work. One thing that I've done that's kind of changed my life is weirdly tracking my cycle. And like different days, I'm different levels of productive, different levels of creative. Some days are better for writing, some days are better for thinking, some days I just want to clean. And so that's like just kind of like paying attention to your own natural rhythms and honoring them and working with them, as opposed to being so rigid with yourself about like, I have to get in this many reps or I must note take. Because I've definitely done that and gone into extremes where I'm like, I'm going to write down everything I ate, everything I wore, and like going to have the most like comprehensive journal that there ever was. And that's just not realistic. So now I have journals that are like about things that I would already be thinking about anyways every day, but now I'm just sitting down and taking the time to write them down. So I think that so much of it, and me being really good at my job, has been not me trying to like be a certain way, but just honoring who I am, trusting that I'm going to see the trends and that all I can do is sharpen the skills that I already have rather than trying to make up some that I don't already have.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's such good advice. And I feel like, with artists, especially once you've made the plunge to full time, and not everyone has, and I think all varying levels of artists are totally valid, but sometimes when people make that initial jump, they sort of, and because now they have all this free time, they sort of try to like structure and rigid, and they're like, well, I'll paint 8 hours a day. And I find that what people tend to miss is like the inspiration part of what you're doing is actually pretty big, and it involves a lot of like what you were saying, listening to yourself. Are you a morning person? Are you, do you work seasonally? Like really kind of, it's something that it seems so basic, but because of what we know about capitalism and how we are demanded to produce productivity, and, and social media requires that to some, similar kind of level, that I think sometimes can override our own instincts, our own, desires, our own way that we sort of live. And I find that when I'm in a place with my art that I'm not listening to those signs, and I haven't carved out the time for joy or fun or ease, that I'm not very good at picking up and getting new inspiration. So I think that you brought that up I hope it's really helpful because that was a breakthrough for me that took, unfortunately, years to get through. I thought I sort of just like was, really pushed myself thinking that that's how to become a really good productive artist and to make all that free time worthwhile. When in reality, it's a lot of like enjoying stuff. And, it doesn't sound like work, but it is vital to the process. If you want to be inspired, if you want to make art that's in line with who you are and what you're excited about, it's a lot of like half days at Disneyland or, walking around the park or, a spa day. Like I know that doesn't sound like creative work, but that's where like inspiration comes from. And I think when you're taking care of yourself, that's where you're going to be at a place where you can tap into those ideas.
Totally. I always think of the show House, and he always has his breakthrough when he's doing something else. It's never when he's like in the OR or anything. He's always like doing something random and then he puts it all together and breaks the case. And I think that that's often me where like we're working on something at work and I go for a walk and then I come back and I'm like I have the solution. So, it's not, I think like you said, capitalism makes you think like you must do these things and you all of these outputs. I personally am in a place where I luckily don't have to monetize my hobbies. And that's like a rule that I stick to. Like, don't monetize your hobbies. I love my job, but anytime I've tried to be like, I'm gonna like book and like talk about it, and I just it takes all of the enjoyment out of it, and just has it been worth it? So I think it's about finding a balance. And luckily, I think now also we have like more of a culture of creation. Younger people are used to kind of supporting their favorite creators, being patrons of their favorite creators, whether that's through Patreon, podcasts, donations on various platforms. So I think that that will also trickle to the art world where it will become more normal for like the everyday person to be like, no, I am a patron of the arts and these are the artists who I love. And hopefully we'll see that culture of creation spread there as well.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up too, because that was another question I had as, a generational expert. I'm very curious. So I have a hunch that the boundaries between creativity, like who is a creator, a formal artist, and who is a consumer, are going to become incredibly muddy. I think everyone is going to be part patron, part consumer, part creator going forward. And I also think that people aren't going to stick to one medium. I think that sticking to one medium, I had a whole podcast about niching down and I've been thinking about it since, but having to hold yourself to one very singular idea, I think is a product of our world moving very slow. That name travels. By the time your name gets out there, if you're on a new body of work, that's not going to work for you. But now, because of the speed of which things are processing, and even things like album cycles are becoming obsolete, I find that the idea that you have to hold on to something longer than it feels natural, luckily, is phasing out. But I'm curious, like, what your thoughts on what creator culture looks like going forward, and it's more specifically for the younger generations. Do you think that the nature at which we can create and consume is going to change?
Yeah. You're so right already about the waters being muddied between like creator and consumer. That's even something that I talk about in my work in social media of like it used to be you had creators and viewers, and now you have this middle class of viewer hybrid creators, viewer creators, and even it's become like a function of apps like TikTok of like to really truly participate in TikTok to even like 75%, you're likely making content. So we're definitely seeing that become more normalized. One thing that I like to do is like zoom out and think about like other forms of communication that revolutionized anything. And like the written word, for instance, like I'm sure there were people having this exact conversation. Like, is everyone just going to know how to write one day? Like, what happens what happens in that world? What does that world look like? And now we all have computers in our pockets.
Yeah.
So we're definitely moving towards a world of creators slash consumers. And what I'm noticing is that the platforms who are succeeding are delivering on creativity tools. So, tools for creativity. That being said, it just unlocks a different layer of creativity. I don't think it like replaces anything. I don't think it just makes it more accessible to more people. And I think that's why creativity is something that people are craving and actively seeking out right now, because they have access to it and it's something that they can do. And I think that it is also given people this notion of like, well, how come some people get to do this for a job and I don't? And like, and I also think that there's just so many more people. And my friend has a digital strategy agency. And one thing I told her is like, you have to realize that a lot of people wouldn't consider themselves content creators, but they are, because maybe they're not the one talking to the camera, but they work for Coca-Cola and they're working on an ad campaign. They are a content creator, or like any sort of marketing is content creation. If you write an email that goes out to 15 people every week, you're a content creator. Like if
Mm-hmm.
you're making PowerPoints, you're a niche content creator. Like, so everything is content, and not all of it is monetizable, but it is all about the thing. What does become monetizable, I feel like, is the pushing of boundaries and the pushing of limits, and being someone who is constantly um, expanding the limits of what is possible in a world where we have all the tools to do everything at our fingertips.
Yeah, no, and that's so good. And it reminds me of like every once in a while the statistic around like they'll poll like the youngest generation and they'll say, 70% of them want to be influencers or YouTubers. And they always say it like in this doomsday kind of way. And I have never understood that, because all that tells me is that young people want to be creative and be themselves. And I feel like, well, that's such a great thing. If I raise a kid who really wants to be creative and be himself, I'd be pretty proud as a parent. And so, I think sometimes people can get weird about it because there is such a scarcity mindset around the creator consumer model. And I think economics is a flawed science. I mean, I think I don't know, maybe that's just my personal take, but assuming that having abundance of new creators is going to somehow flood the market, I can say personally, I know plenty of people who started following me just because it was easy art on Instagram, and they would never consider themselves art people or consumers of art, and they didn't go to museums, and then all of a sudden now they're buying from multiple artists, and it's because they bought their first print from me. And it's like, and I think the people creating are growing and changing and evolving and reflecting different kinds of peoples and communities who've often been left out of these conversations. I don't think it's that we're fighting for the same few people. I think more people are going to consume and create. And I think it's this wonderful abundance and growth, for the most part. And so I don't know. I'm curious what you think whenever that little, I don't know if you've heard it, but that doomsday, everyone wants to be an influencer quote goes around.
Oh yes. And I've definitely been one of the people presenting that. I don't present it as like a doomsday quote, but
Yeah.
definitely like that social media is very top of mind and aspirational for these people. But I think you're so right. It's not necessarily that they want to be a social media star, it's that they see the autonomy, the creative freedom, the fun that these people are having, and they want to do that as well. And I think that it goes back to what I was saying about we're moving away from these mega influencers with 10 million followers and more towards meaningful connections and smaller communities. So I think that we're going to kind of see the more like village model, but like online. So you'll have like your little online village of people, and like everyone who's like ideologically connected and aesthetically connected, and everyone's going to have their own customized village of people that's just for them. And I'm sure the metaverse will find a way to like actually like make this a reality that you can see and be tangible for you. But it'd be like, imagine you go to Megan Land and I have a museum and there's Sari's works of art, and you can visit, my museum, and it's like the artists that are interesting to me. So
Yes.
I think that's where we're headed. It's going to be like more democratized, I guess. Creativity is going to be more democratized, and we'll see fewer influencers who are massive. And the way I'm seeing that manifest now is everyone's like culture's kind of mid. Like everything's kind of boring. I don't know, it's not that good. But as someone who like studies this, it's because right now we have people catering to the majority. And anytime you cater to the majority and what everybody can agree on, it's watered down, not that exciting. It's not going to like really move and resonate people, but it's just going to make everyone kind of go, yeah, that's good, I guess. Yeah, we all agree. But what people really want are those things that make them feel something, that really move them, that really hit on something that they are feeling, thinking about. And I think we're seeing the fatigue of the mass boring monoculture. And so I think we're going to have a overcorrection to microcultures and like these little smaller niche communities that are like hyper connected. We already kind of see this with like clean girl and
Mhm.
like coconut girl, but I think we'll see it in a more values driven way.
Yeah, I think that's such, what you just said is like totally soothing for artists, because, you get so caught up in like this idea that just because that's how the model's been, like everyone kind of has to like you in order for you to become successful as an artist. But I find that like the most community that I've been the most proud of to sort of create with my art has been often at risk of alienating people. So obviously when you make artwork that's
Mhm.
teenage girl specific, you're going to have a whole demographic that's going to plug their nose and run away. And I think that's why like up until really recently, like a 90 something percent TikTok people who identify as female follower rate. And it was like 90 on Instagram. And it's in, you think of that and you can think of it in terms of like, oh, that's such a loss. But I find that the more it's a delicate balance, and I think the way to navigate it is just like be really authentic to yourself. But I think it's a delicate balance of like the more you sort of push away mainstream culture, yes, okay, are you risking not having the next big art thing and becoming a millionaire? I guess maybe shoot your shot, but what you do when you alienate that and be authentic to yourself is you're finding people who are really excited about what you're doing because they're not seeing that reflected in other people. And so the more you can make art, you think, oh, don't get too niche because then no one will find you. But if you continue to plug and make people who are really excited about you, you're going to be able to tap into things like word of mouth and people who are excited enough to buy something that costs $3, $4, $5,000. Like I can even tell you with like my bodies of work, like people love the disco balls, but I don't have too many people who are like, this changed my life in the way that other works that I've made are. And they're different. And there's, I don't think anything's good or bad, less good, less bad than anything. But I just think it's something that artists need to be really mindful of. And I think what you just said is probably soothing some people right now of like smaller, more niche groups, more tapped into your ideology. And yeah, I think that's really exciting to hear.
When I first started going like when I first started getting on the FYP a lot on TikTok, one of the comments I got most often was some variation of like, had a similar thought, but I wasn't going to say anything, or this bothered me, but I didn't really know why. You really put words to it. And so there is value in that. And that is where you're going to get the most engagement of really those people who are seeing the same things that you are, but you maybe are 5 steps ahead of them on this trail. And you're able to point out the thing that's going to be interesting to them when they get to where you are.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And finding community. And that's always like my biggest advice whenever if I ever meet someone and they're like, how do I be an artist? Just like be authentic, which I think we've, really covered, but then also, grow a small community and it can be really small. Like I know plenty of people who, have what is it, like 100 true fans kind of idea, but like a few thousand followers and, they're smart, they can monetize it. They've sort of adjusted their life to fit that kind of a model. But there's definitely ways, to be an artist with a smaller community. And I think it's exciting too to hear you say all that because I think sometimes artists get this feeling that like it's too late. There's already enough artists who are saying similar enough stuff. Like I can't add anything to it. And I vehemently disagree with that because I think, kind of one of the wonders of the world is like there's no two people who are the same. And I think, that's like a fact and we gloss over it, but it's like it's miraculous. Like it really is special. And I think, if someone doesn't feel like they're going to make art because they're going to just start making art like someone else, and that's totally fine, to learn that way. I would say that you will eventually hit a fork in the road where you want to do something different. And that's where the magic starts to happen. And I would encourage people it's never too late. Social media feels saturated, sure, but there's more people logging on. There's more people who are getting into art all the time. Like I know as being a creator online that like I have audience turnover all the time. Like every 6 to 8 months, it feels like I get a whole different crop of people. And I have my core 20, but then like it's really like it's never too late. And what you have to say is valuable even if you don't feel like it is.
I also think one thing we're seeing more in a shift towards social media and in a shift due to social media and a change in marketing and just kind of consumerism in general is that for so long we've been focused on youth because that's who you're able to kind of form their opinions and then have a lifelong customer. However, I'm noticing and kind of predicting that as people have access to tools like TikTok and Instagram, it's less about what's popular and more about what is super relevant to them, even as they age. And so it's going to kind of like create these little generational bubbles of celebrity and interest and zeitgeist. And boomers have a zeitgeist, Gen Xers have a zeitgeist. You won't age out of the zeitgeist, you'll just age into a different one. And so I think that that's going to I think the millennials are going to be the first generation who are really going to do this. And kind of, I've even seeing it of like, it used to be trends were always so youth driven. And now I kind of have to parse through and be like, even though this is a trend, it's a millennial trend and it's like driven by a bunch of 40-year-olds. And that is cool and interesting for me to see as a generational researcher of like, even the way we're going to have to look at generations is changing due to new technologies. So, the way that things were isn't the way that they have to be necessarily.
Yeah, like you don't age out of like creativity. I feel
Yeah.
like since we have, I feel like a lot of times like people's engagement on social media to me feels creative. Like I know people like to draw this big thick line in the sand between content creator, content consumer, I guess, and artist, and I don't think there is cut and dry as it seems. And so what's interesting about that is millennials are saying, hey, like I still want to find and discover new things, new styles, new people, new books, new whatever. And I think it's, to me, it's a signal that like we are becoming a more creative culture. And to be fair, I think America's only had
Yes.
up to go. I think we, because of how mass consumery and, the legacy of America, like we really could only go one direction. So, I think that that's a really exciting thing. And I guess if I wanted to encourage anyone, I would say like, it's never too late to get on social media because like you're not aging out of things. What you have to say and think is interesting, especially if you're thoughtful and authentic about it. But that's so good to hear. I appreciate that so much. Can I ask you, okay, so to pivot slightly, and kind of get to the our final question, sadly, but I was curious about your experience in Spain. And so something that I feel pretty passionately about is that, you don't have to be good at like you don't have to, it doesn't have to be your niche for you to go and enjoy something. So I get questions a lot, people who like have never picked up a paintbrush and want to come paint with me or take a class or whatever. And I think sometimes people are so bogged down by the idea that they have to be instantly, and I'm saying good as in like you can instantly sell what you're doing and monetize it, that people become discouraged. But what was so exciting about having you and Capri on, another person who both, if you don't mind me sharing this, admitted that they had never really
Yeah.
painted before and that they were total novices. But I had two people who were, yeah, who never painted and were in the course. And I feel like I learned as much from you guys as you did me. So it was such a fun experience. But I'm curious, like, how has that helped you in your other creative endeavors? Do you think more people are, is that a trend, if I can ask you that? And yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's definitely a trend because this year, the emergent conversation has all been about community and people looking to find community. And I see more and more people going on trips or like signing up for like these types of excursions around a hobby or an interest. And so that is definitely one way that I was like living ahead of the curve, and you too, by hosting it last year and like going to it. And I wrote about it for work and people found it really interesting. I went with the specific purpose of trying to do something I was bad at because that is something I struggle with, perfectionism and not doing things, especially creative things, because I'm so hard on myself. And if it's not perfect, I get annoyed. And I think that taking the course that you did was, it kind of unlocked the idea for me that creativity is a practice. I didn't really understand that and that there is a process to it. And I am a writer. I feel like I didn't say that before that, but I do now because the way that you approached painting, I was like, oh, I kind of do this for writing. And like since then, I feel like it's changed the way I write and my writing practice, so to speak. And so that's been really cool. And it's unlocked a lot of creativity for me. But I would say it also helped me understand, it was kind of like watching an episode of How It's Made and then you walk away with a whole new appreciation for whatever you're watching get made. That was me and just art in general and kind of art as a concept. And you talked about photorealism and it not being about capturing like what you're seeing, but kind of like the experience of seeing it. And that has unlocked so much for me, especially as we're talking about AI and AI generated art. And Lisa, who is also on the trip, talked about perception on Instagram. And I was like, this is why AI cannot actually create art because art is inherently this process. It's not a product. And I think that understanding art has helped me understand creativity even more even if I'm not a painter, so to speak. And I did have fun, and I do still paint sometimes. And I feel like I am a better artist for it in all of the things that I do creatively, even though I didn't like walk away from a Van Gogh. That said, I do want to go again if you do it. I know you're doing it this year, but if you do it again next year, I'm
Yeah.
definitely hoping to go.
Oh, I would love that. Yeah, we're hoping to do it every year, but I love that. And something you said also reminded me, like I believe that the world is better with more artists in it, and I do use the term artist generously. I think we gatekeep it, and it's weird and creepy because like who do we hurt? It's not like a structural engineer. Like I want those people to go through multiple testing before they can call themselves that, or a neurosurgeon. But an artist is such like it's so innate to just being human, and like I always ask myself when there's hesitation around something or a limitation, like who does this help to uphold and who does it hurt? And for me, more people calling themselves artists hurts literally no one. It doesn't, I'm a professional artist and it doesn't hurt me if you call yourself an artist, you know? But I also think that, something you said reminded me that the more people create and kind of learn how it gets made, the more you have more insight into an appreciation for what you're looking at. And something else I feel like there's a bit of a scarcity model around, and there shouldn't be, is compassion. And, I deal with troll comments, somewhat on the regular. I don't do anything too incendiary, but when people say stuff about my art, I always go and see if they're an artist too. And I feel like the more people understood kind of what went into it, they'd be better consumers. And I don't mean better as in like I would get less troll comments because who cares, but I mean better as in like your experience of the world changes when you are part of a creative practice and you realize how much goes into it, and you bust through that Dunning-Kruger whatever graph a little bit. But yeah, no, I think that's wonderful.
And also something you said too was the idea of like, even when you talk about pricing, like all of the work that you've created and your expertise being like part of what goes into it, and kind of there being value in just like practicing. I feel like that's been something I've taken with me also, of like, especially as I'm further along in my career and I'm like, oh, should I really be charging the prices that I'm charging? But I'm like, no, I've been studying this for 10 years and that's why I'm able to do it in an hour, but it would take someone else 3 days. So it's fine that I'm charging this amount because it's like, I have notes on this, I've read books on this, and all of that is also going into all of that. So I think I didn't understand that until you broke it down for me in terms of like paintings and
Yeah.
supplies, and I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Oh, yeah, totally. No, I mean, I think a lot of artists undervalue themselves, but I mean, that makes sense in a world that undervalues artists and
Yes.
artistic work and creative work, and it's all been commoditized and chewed up by the machine. I feel like we're in a stage where we're starting to unravel and be really critical of like how art normally is and how like detached and I don't know how yucky it's been for so long. And now that more people are making art, and and to my point about like more people should make art, whether or not they're good at it or whether or not they can sell it, is I think it's just such a net positive, because not only does it make your life better, but I don't know, it just makes the whole world a better place. I guess I could, again, I'm going to get off my soapbox, but like that's like my biggest message is like make art, just get out there, just do it, have compassion for yourself to like get messy, make something you don't love. And yeah, it teaches you a lot about how to value yourself and that you are worth value. I think a lot of times people are really cut off from the value part of their labor because they work for a company or, a pricing model that feels removed from them. But there is value to what you make. And just like when my little kids come up to me with their little drawings and stuff and they look very age appropriate, like I would never be like, oh, you can't sell that. Like it's so beautiful and it's so sweet. And I don't think when you grow up, you grow out of that level of love and compassion. You just, I don't know. Anyways, I'm just getting rambly here, but totally. Yay. Okay. Well, that's all my questions for you for today. Although I could probably sit here and just ask you about everything. The hard part, y'all, about talking to a trend forecaster is like not asking you about every single trend and getting your opinion. But if you want to listen more to Megan, she has a podcast. She posts on TikTok. And so I definitely recommend following her, keeping up the conversation. But Megan, I just want to say thank you so much for chatting with me. I really appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate your insight. I think my viewers are going to really find a lot of value in what you have to say here and going forward. So thank you again for your time with me today. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It changed my life meeting you and doing the Spain retreat, and you've opened up my mind to so much stuff. So to hear that you think I'm insightful is just, I can't even. So thank you for having me.
Yay, thank you. I also want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's taken the time to leave a review on this podcast. It really helps emerging podcasts like the Not Sorry Art podcast to sort of gain some footing in the Apple Store. It helps people be able to find me. And as always, it's really helpful to see y'all's feedback and help me to guide the direction of this podcast with your reviews. This week in particular, I'd like to thank at Travel Paint Create. That's at TravelPaintCreate. Thank you so much for your review. I really appreciate it. And if you want to have your handle read off on next week's episode, make sure to leave a review, leave your handle in that review, and I'll read it off. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys, and happy creating.